on. Thank you for starting the recording. Our session is the governance of farm-level digital technologies and agricultural data. And we'll be running this session as a panel with 4 shorter presentations and then an open set of questions. So my name is Sarah Louise Reuter, and I'm one of the organizers for this panel. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia in the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability in Vancouver, Canada. And I'm joining today from Vancouver, which is the traditional unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I'm joined as a co-organizer here by my lovely professor and supervisor, Dr. Hannah Whitman. And so I'll let Hannah introduce herself.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're really looking forward to an exciting conversation. I'm Hannah Whitman. I'm a professor here at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and I have joined with me, I'll let Ilyas introduce himself, visiting from Brazil.
Hello, my name is Ilyas Siddiq. I'm professor at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in southern Brazil, and I also coordinate the agroecological agroforestry network of southern Brazil, where we work on databases, citizen science databases, and collaborate with LightFarm here with UBC.
Thank you. Okay, so in our session of presentations today, I will present on a topic that we introduced this past October, Hannah, myself, and another individual called Kevin Cusson, who all worked together on an application called LightFarm. And we spoke about data justice, data sovereignty, and food sovereignty. And so this panel is inspired by that conversation, which really couldn't fit just in a coffee session. And so we were invited to come back, invite some other folks to expand upon that. And so that presentation is recorded and available through the IGAD network. But following a short update on the presentation that we gave in October, we'll be joined by Alicia Miller, who's representing Digital Green, which is an international network, but today she's joining from Kansas in the United States. Then Dr. Marcus Schmidt, who's joining from Germany to talk from the perspective of publishing sensitive agricultural data, working with the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research. And then finally, Dr. Anton Eitzinger, who is currently in Colombia, working with the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. And so without getting too much further behind, I will begin with my short presentation. Okay. Could someone please tell me if they're seeing the correct screen? Hannah, is this my starting slide?
Yes, you can see it.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, and I will just start my timer here. Excellent. So to begin, I'll be presenting on the challenges of data sovereignty and data justice in practice. And so this is part of my PhD research at the University of British Columbia, but also the way that I'm contributing to this broader collective of LightFarm. So in our time today, I'll start with some context, the politics of big data and agriculture, probably not a new topic to many of the folks in the room, but just to set some context, I'll start there. And then talk about some definitions or concepts of data justice and food sovereignty, and focusing for the remainder of the time on what is LightFarm, what does it do, what was the process of designing the data policy, and how that aims to enact data justice, and then finally talking about some practical challenges. Okay, so for context, the agricultural sector or the agricultural markets globally are increasingly concentrated with corporations in input sectors being a particularly important place to spend some attention. And so we're seeing mega mergers and then yes, acquisitions and just really massive concentrations of wealth and capital for these corporations. And a lot of what is happening here is the acquisition of smaller companies, followed by these mega mergers of existing large companies, for example, the Bayer Monsanto. But it's not just about the fertilizers, the seeds, and the pesticides. These same corporations are also increasingly acquiring smaller agri-food technology companies and startups. And this new new momentum of digital technologies and apps. And so keeping with the Bayer Monsanto example, prior to that mega merger, Monsanto had acquired Climate Field View, which was one of the leading farm level apps here in North America. In addition to 5 others here on the screen of FieldScript and Climate Pro. And so not only are we seeing a concentration of capital, but also a concentration of data and what that data can enable. And this raises concerns because not only does this represent a concentration of power in corporate capital, but also over what the tools can do, their functionality, what data is collected, and then building upon that, what systems of crop production and labor configurations will prevail now and in the future. So thus far, we're seeing a big divide. This is a pretty polarizing conversation where proponents are saying that these technologies and the data, of course, is essential for feeding the growing population, for addressing climate change and having sustainable farms in an increasingly volatile future. Whereas we see critics arguing that these technologies are indeed antithetical to the visions of sustainable agriculture that they are advancing. But research in our group and elsewhere is arguing that it doesn't have to be an either or. And these digital technologies and the use of data could be used to enhance both food sovereignty and data justice if there is an intentional intervention, an intentional governance model to ensure that both of those principles are at the forefront. So we argue that the governance of farm level digital technologies and agricultural data should support food sovereignty and data justice. And just for the sake of clarity, food sovereignty, the definition we're using here, is the prominent definition from La Via Campesina. So the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their food and agricultural systems. So here, not only food security, but also the right, some agency in determining their own food systems and what they eat. And then also this addition of ecologically sound and sustainable methods being central to the concept of food sovereignty. Data justice, again, here is also around rights. So the rights to be fairly represented in data sets, the rights to hold some aspects of their lives and identities private, but also to have access and ownership to data, not only about them, but in service of them. Put another way, data justice is fairness about how people are made visible through data, how they are represented, and then treated as a result of that data production. I will be using this framework as we go forward, but there are a few different ways to look at data justice more practically. And so one of the approaches is to take existing theories or dimensions of justice and apply them to the data context. So here, Heeks and Cgir outline 5 different dimensions of justice and apply them to data. So procedural being fairness in the way the data is handled, instrumental being fairness in the use of the data, and so on. And so we'll come back to these further, but we talk a lot about the procedural, instrumental, and rights-based. These can fit pretty cleanly into a data policy or a data governance policy, or data privacy policy or data governance policy. But the structural and distributive here are really quite essential as well. And they speak to the broader context that I introduced at the beginning with power in the food system and how, these applications are in a broader context of food systems change and unequal power relations. So now we introduce LightFarm. This is something we brought to IGAD in October, as I mentioned before. So I will speak to it briefly, but for those of you who haven't heard of it before, it's an application that was developed through the UBC Farm, the Center for Sustainable Food Systems, from its inception through collaboration with farmers, researchers, and scientists. And it is currently still housed at UBC, but transitioning new ways of being and ownership of the technology, which we could talk about if there are questions. But absolutely essential is that the LightFarm app is open access, open source, and free. Logistically, it is a web-based application, and it is a non-commercial entity that prioritizes the needs of sustainable, diversified farmers, but is open to anyone who would like to use it. And then on the right here, I have some images of what the app looks like. So who is the LightFarm team? It's a really diverse group of folks that started with Professor Hannah Whitman, who's on the call, a past research associate and postdoctoral student or postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Zia Mehrabi, and then grew over the past 5 years into a group of students, of farmers, participatory global networks of farming organizations, and has continued to evolve over time. So to give a brief sense of the history, really this began as an idea in a coffee shop in 2017, and now is an app that's been used by 2,000 users internationally in over 80 countries. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, the in-person testing was paused briefly from 2020 to 2021. But as of this past spring, the in-person fieldwork and user testing has continued. And Professor Whitman was just in Brazil again, continuing that work. So it's been quite exciting. And then I'm not sure if Kevin is in the room, but he was also a pivotal part of this process, and he was hired in 2020 as the first full-time staff of LightFarm. And I'll skip through the farmer testimonials for the sake of time, but folks are using this and it is working well for many of them. So the goals of the app are many. The first is to improve access of digital agricultural technology and data for farming communities globally, especially with these small scale diversified producers that may not have access to the same kinds of infrastructure needed than the options that are available to a farmer in Canada. So the goal, one of the practical goals here, is to increase the access of the application to 10,000 diversified farmers. So the soft launch has been gradual over the past couple of years, but now as the app continues to improve, we're looking to have more of a push into farmer engagement over the next year and a half. Then also to gain insights and on the challenges and opportunities for diversified farming in particular. So this is something unique about LightFarm. It was always developed with that population in mind, front and center. And then to advance data-driven agroecological transitions globally and locally. And finally, to lead by example on data justice and demonstrate the feasibility of a non-commercial digital farming platform, which is part of where the practical challenges really come to the fore. So what it looks like, we can answer some questions about this in the Q&A, but on the left, I have a picture here of a sample farm. And so there are ways to map different parts of your farm. It's pretty, I think it's pretty to look at. It's also been tested to be pretty user-friendly. You can map out these different dimensions of your farm and input data on what is happening in that plot. And then you can sequence tasks. There's a labor component, there's finances, and so all of that can work into itself. And it continues to be an iterative process with a lot of input from farmer users and other farmer networks on what is most useful to them. So what does it mean to be an open access, open source, and free app? It means a lot of things, but some of them that I will add on the slide here are that the code is free and open source. So that was something that was important since the app's inception. And also the fact that it is free is a challenge practically to ensure the livelihood of, or the feasibility of LightFarm over time. But it was always very important that the data and data analytics were never sold in any way. And so currently the funding model is entirely donor and grant driven, but that's a challenge that we'll continue to be grappling with as time goes on. Then I'll also mention that even on the website, there are places for researchers, experts, and others across the world to engage. So there are these public resources on the homepage on the About Us, I believe, that you can make suggestions on a portal. You can follow their portal of different like upcoming launches and the things that they're currently working on at the development team, and then also interact in different online forums, including their GitHub, for example. So in our final few minutes here, I really want to dial in on the data. What data does LightFarm collect? So here we have the main categories on the screen, and all of this is included in the data privacy policy when farmers or users are choosing whether or not to use the app. Some of this data is necessary to be able to use the app. So you need to have a name, a location, for example, to choose your language and units. But other is up to you how much you want to add or integrate into the app. And most of this is inputted by the farmer themselves, but there's also some integration with other applications and databases. So that be for weather or biodiversity data with the Citizen Science Initiative, iNaturalist. Thus far, in our consultations with farmers that predate my involvement in the app for sure by many years, we've seen a few consistent messages that farmers care a lot about the data being useful to them. There are many tools available. There is so much information out there. And so if they're going to be using this app, it needs to be relevant and provide support for things that they already care about, their own goals, whether that be reaching their certification for organic producers, for example, or profitability on their farm. The data needs to be accessible to them, so the app needs to make sense and needs to be easy to use. And then finally, the data sharing is a very sensitive topic. Data is only to be shared under specific conditions, and there is a consistent concern around data and for-profit corporations in particular about what it means for them to have the data. Most farmers are saying absolutely not. They do not want that, but for different reasons, different contexts. So for example, in Canada, we're hearing concern over tracking endangered species populations through the iNaturalist side, so the biodiversity data. Absolutely do not want that to be shared with governments. But then in other countries, it could be about, like land use protection, like conservation areas and integrating with that. But basically the data being used to then regulate the farmers and their operations. So how is the data governed, managed, and protected? Currently, this all is outlined in the data privacy policy and consent form through the application. A lot of effort went into making this as accessible and comprehensive as possible. And there is a foundational principle of wanting the farmers to be in control of their data and to prioritize data justice. But there are some practical concerns in bringing this to light. So the approach in the privacy policy now is very much kind of a Q&A design, which helps skim through the information rather quickly for farmers and is oriented towards questions that they may already have. And so, who has access to the data? What are cookies and why do they use them under what circumstances? And what happens if you withdraw consent? So I have an example here of the wording. So what are your rights with respect to your personal information? This will be recorded, and so you can go back and pause if you want to read it in detail, or go to the link at the bottom. So just lightfarm.org and then .your data. And so it's intended to be very accessible language, and farmers having full control over what they want the data, or if they'd like to no longer be part of the app, and what limitations they have on the data sharing and use. So returning to that initial 5 principles, the procedural data, I have key points here from the data policy, the questions that are answered for each of these. And so I hinted to this at the beginning, but procedural data is pretty simple to integrate, or procedural justice rather, is pretty simple to integrate into the data policy. We can answer questions about how the data is stored or protected, for example. Instrumental, how is it used? How is it shared? To whom? Under what conditions? Rights-based, what are your rights? So the example I had on the slide before is exactly to that. And then the structural and distributive have more of a challenging time integrating into the data policy, but they're central to the project's mission, the mission of LightFarm. And so that's included in the data policy at the beginning in terms of who is LightFarm and why do they do what they do. And I am through my time, so we can talk more about the practical challenges in the Q&A, but I just want to acknowledge that I'm one very small piece of this project, and I'm keen to be a part of it and chatting about it with you. But I just want to name the project manager, Kevin Cusson, Professor Hannah Whitman, who's on the call with us today, and then also Zia Mehrabi, who is a co-founder of the application. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah Louise. It's brought up this project has brought up a lot of questions for us about kind of the politics and ethics of data governance. I'm really looking forward to getting into that in the discussion. I think we should take just maybe 1 or 2 questions of clarification, and then we'll move on to the next talk, and then we'll have a broader discussion at the end. So if anybody has a question of clarification, maybe raise your hand and I'll call on you. Otherwise, we can move along to Alicia Miller from Digital Green.
Yeah, you're also welcome to put questions in the chat, which we can answer via text or keep until our question is answered.
Very good. Thank you for having me. I think my presentation will actually flow nicely from yours, and there's a lot of some similarities between what we're thinking about and doing. So let me share my screen, and let me make sure I'm actually in the right. I think I'm not in the right slide, so I'll go to the beginning here. Okay. Does that look right? Almost. Okay.
Perfect. Looks great.
Great. So I'm Alicia Miller. I'm Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at Digital Green, and I've kind of changed my title here, but working toward digital infrastructure for farmer empowerment is what I wanted to share. So this is Digital Green's mission, creating a world where farmers use technology and data to build prosperous communities. We actually shifted our mission recently to really orient farmers as sort of the key actors here, and both sort of the utilizers of data and technology, but also the people who have agency to think about what it means for a prosperous community to thrive. So I wanted to start with that because it's been a whole kind of reorientation in the last few years for us about how we want to think about the work we're doing. So Digital Green we've been around a little over 13 years, and we primarily worked on improving public extension systems to enable kind of greater reach and effectiveness for farmers. And so we've done that through farmer-to-farmer extension videos. These are videos by farmers explaining best practices in local languages, in local context, and then they get screened in community screenings. In India, which is where we started, we primarily work through women's self-help groups, and in other countries, it's different farmer groups. So in Ethiopia, we work with development groups, and there are just different existing structures that we kind of layer this on top of. We've reached over 2.6 million farmers. The vast majority of them are women, starting because we layer in India on top of these women's self-help groups. And we've done that in collaboration with the government extension systems in these countries, over 46,000. So you can imagine this process, by the nature of how we designed it, it's farmer driven, but it also collects sort of input and feedback from farmers so that it can be self-improving. It's collected a lot of data. So the way that this works is in community video screenings, there's membership of these groups kind of collected, maybe phone numbers are collected, attendance records, but then also adoption data. So we ask farmers if they adopted a practice, and then there's actually confirmation in the field after the fact by extension agents for a subset of those adoptions. And so we kind of amassed this large data set over time that was really designed to improve the effectiveness of the advisory system. But over time, we started to have others approaching us about how this data could be used, maybe to sort of unlock some other service or to do research on the data. And we started to kind of have this internal conversation about the utility of this data for farmers themselves, how the data could be kind of leveraged in a way that respected farmer rights, what else Digital Green could be doing essentially in this ecosystem. And that conversation has been going for more than 5 years. Digital Green does other things other than advisory. We also kind of develop other apps and solutions. And so we started to think internally about like what kind of ecosystem would we want to contribute to, and do we have a role to play there? And so I just wanted to kind of share how we've been thinking about it, which aligns so well with, I'm sure, many of the speakers here. But what kind of digital ecosystem do we imagine would be the one we'd want to contribute to? So one, obviously protecting individual rights, but then also the rights of the individual and the control of the individual in that ecosystem. We wanted to see interfaces and tools that made it easy, intuitive, and even empowering to kind of manage your own data in that ecosystem. Because we always have worked through community groups, also thinking about how groups can play a bigger and bigger role. We know that data is most valuable when it's aggregated. And as Sarah pointed out, oftentimes now that's done by corporations, but how can community groups kind of play a bigger role in stewarding and supporting individual data management? How can the ecosystem really put more choice in the farmer's control around how they sort of stack or bundle services that are available in the digital ecosystem? So how can they really drive the efficiency rather than having the sort of massive kind of concentration or bundling by a few actors? How can we make this ecosystem secure and trusted in the way that data is exchanged, realizing that like if people don't exchange data, we can't find solutions at the intersection of these data for the utility of anyone in the system. And then how do we get to high interoperability, efficiency, and sort of a reduction of silos? Again, trying to break through the sort of trust issues. That led us to start working on something that's now available online, Farmstack, which is an open source protocol that's designed to power the secure transfer of data. And this is really a back-end protocol. This is something that we started working on about 3 years ago to get at this issue of trust that I was mentioning, that we would encounter, as I'm sure all of you have, organizations that wanted to work together, that had some sort of data set that they thought could be valuable if combined or in some way used with another data set. But because people know that the legal agreements around usage are not easily enforced or can be easily broken, there's a hesitation around sharing that. And so Farmstack is a protocol, not a platform, that it operates at the system level. It's open source and it's community governed. I'll talk in a minute about what that means. And it basically has usage policy kind of templates that are built into it that articulate common ways that people want to share or exchange data. So for instance, I can say, I want to provide this data to you, but I want it to expire in 30 days, or I want to share it, but you can't edit it, or I want to share it, but only a particular application can consume that data. Those kinds of very specific usage policies can be chosen within the Farmstack sort of templates, or custom ones can be designed. And then the actual software itself is enshrining that protection for the peers that are exchanging that data. So as a data owner, I can articulate those usage policies. I download a peer-to-peer connector, and then the entity that I'm going to exchange the data with also has a peer-to-peer connector, and sort of the secure container that the software contains prevents it from being used in any other way. So this is primarily being used now. It is only being used right now at the organization level. And we use it ourselves to improve advisory messages, doing things like combining soil and weather data to kind of improve the specificity of advisories. But we also have use cases where others are using this for a whole host of data exchange needs, lots of different use cases, and we hope that this continues to grow. But this addresses the organization level. It doesn't get to the farmer level yet, which is where we want to see this going. And so where we envision it going is that the farmer level, ultimately farmers have more agency and control over their data. They're able to discover services and sort of opt into those services, and that they are able to easily give or revoke consent within a lot of different applications. This is the sort of community governance. This is just a visual to help explain it. But ultimately, there's a steward for the Farmstack instance. Where we're working, this is tending to be government entities to start. So it would be like the Ministry of Agriculture in Ethiopia, where we are in fact standing up this instance. They ensure alignment with sort of the data protection laws that exist. They would be essentially making sure that bad actors, if there was an actor that was, let's say, intentionally exchanging bad data, like into the ecosystem, that they could kind of remove or prevent that from happening. But they are not intermediating that exchange between the peers of the data. So neither Digital Green nor the Stewards sits at the intersection of an exchange between two actors. This is really peer-to-peer. And so what we envision is this ecosystem where different organizations can do this exchange, can make data sort of searchable or discoverable by others within the ecosystem. They can either set specific permissions or kind of work in a custom way for those who request access to the data. And then ultimately this starts to kind of create a decentralized network where farmers also can exchange eventually. This is not yet there. So why don't farmers have the benefit of being able to manage their own data? Like, what gets in the way? This is something we're spending a lot of time on. The first is just the lack of incentives to actually capture and manage your own data. It can be laborious to capture data, especially if you're talking about practice data. What did I do when throughout the season? And what value do I get from capturing that, really, is, I think, a question that we're wrestling with and want to make sure we kind of get a lot of farmer input on. low digital and data confidence, and also capabilities and access in the digital space. We work in Ethiopia where access to a mobile phone and internet is just very, very low still. Lack of accessible tools that help to make that management of the data easy don't exist. I've already talked about sort of the value of data at the aggregated level versus individual. Like how do you make that data valuable beyond you as an individual to potential service providers? And then I think what Sarah talked about, there's just a lot of inertia around, those who have big data sets provide great services because they use that data to improve services, which means if I want to access that, I basically am incentivized to comply with whatever the sort of rules are. So where we're moving is towards a data wallet approach, which is something that I think you've seen in lots of sectors. But what we envision is that ultimately farmers would have some ability on their mobile phone to manage this sort of both static data, things like field boundary data, and more dynamic data, things like practice data, and be able to offer access to service providers or whomever they're kind of wanting to exchange that data with in an easy way, so that every time they're kind of approaching or being approached or considering a service, they don't have to enter the exact same information, but actually can kind of share that in an easier way, and that they could revoke access to that. This is a concept that we know is emerging in a lot of places, and we're interested in collaborators who are thinking about this or designing something similar, because we think it makes sense in this decentralized kind of ecosystem I'm describing, and in a farmer-centered approach for the farmer to have control and portability over that data as they use different service providers. We have a version of it that's kind of in beta, but we'll continue to work on that. I wanted to show this. This actually got sent to me this morning by a colleague, but I mentioned that consent is a big part of what we're doing. We've developed a consent manager that essentially can be embedded within different applications. And we have this tool here called Kisan Diary that we use with farmers organizations to capture member data. They use that data around things like demand for inputs or products that are available to then get better prices in the market for their members. And so we've embedded a consent manager flow within Kisan Diary Enterprise that I was going to take just 1 minute to show. And we think that this is something that will be open source also, and that other people can kind of use, but it's in a early stage here. So I'll play this and then I'll wrap up. Hopefully the sound comes through. Let me know if it does not.
Yeah, there's no sound, but we can see the image.
Oops. So if you don't get sound, what it's saying is that the icons help to explain abstract concepts about how the data is actually being shared and with whom, and that this could be customized to different apps. It also explains what the exact benefit will be of sharing that data. It explains that the farmer has total control and that they can revoke access to that data if they choose to, and it gives them an explanation of how to do that. They're asked at the end of the video, would they like to grant consent or not? And then they're given a phone number that they can give a missed call to in case they want to revoke consent. Same video also gets shown to existing farmers that already have data in the ecosystem. It's a little different, but they get true, false questions. And then at the end, they're asked if they want to give access or not. So this is a tool that we're piloting right now, trying to, oops, sorry, this is starting over. Sorry. I'll just go to my last slide here. So we're piloting that and are hoping to kind of integrate that into all of our tools, but also make it open for others to embed in their tools as we kind of refine it and make it easier. So I'll just end on this last slide once it loads. Apologies. Okay, not sure why it's not loading, but there we go. So just wanted to share kind of where where we're going. Sorry. One moment. I think my computer is sort of freezing. I'll just wrap up by saying that we're kind of taking a three-pronged approach to our strategy going forward, which is we're continuing to work on digital capacity strengthening for advisory systems working in partnership with government. But we're also now focusing a lot more on the sort of digital capacity of farmers organizations themselves, which will mean not only kind of building tools that will enable that, but also investing in sort of digital confidence building and really co-developing a lot of these farmer-facing tools with their input. And we're also looking at farmer benchmarking so that farmers see the inherent value of data for themselves, right? Not with a service provider, but just seeing that I can actually use data to understand how my practices may be resulting in different outcomes than my neighbor's practices. We also have a number of kind of use cases that are around helping to connect farmers to market-based services, which is what you saw with that KDE kind of tool, capturing member data and using that to get access to services or market opportunities. And this is where we'll be designing these scalable informed consent tools that both will use, but hopefully others can as well. We're working a lot on this data wallet concept and developing that in partnership with other kind of open source developers. And then we're ultimately really excited about kind of co-designing this ecosystem. You know, Farmstack is one protocol to contribute, but we want to design this with other sort of open source and digital public good builders. And we have a number of kind of communities that we've been participating in to do that, where we're seeing how something like Farmstack could fit together with other protocols, other platforms to create kind of this empowering network that I was talking about at the beginning. And then we're also kind of exploring Web3 and how some of those tools might be experimented with early on behalf of smallholder farmers. So that's my presentation. Looking forward to the conversation, and feel free to contact me if there's any questions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Alicia. Super interesting. We have time for one or two questions of clarification if people have one. I have one, actually, just on that last point about the consent manager. And I'm thinking about the push-pull and sort of over time as farmers use these tools. When would they kind of be presented with that opportunity to consent? Is it sort of, I guess the flow of like as new opportunities arise, does it push? Is it a push or is it a pull kind of consent?
So
dynamic?
right now the way it's working, and I'll just use that example. I didn't give you a lot of detail. I kind of dropped it in because I got it this morning and I thought it might
Super
be
interesting.
But right now the way it works is we're primarily, so Kisan Diary Enterprise is a farmer organization level tool. So it's supporting farmers organizations that are capturing member data to basically get a sense of input demand and then help with marketing, right? Like what do we have available to sell? And so the farmers that are being onboarded, like, because it's a continuous process of gathering member data for these farmers organizations. If they're new farmers, they're seeing it as they're giving that data. So like as I'm being asked to enter my initial, my name, my phone number, a lot of the kind of static pieces of data, I'm getting that that video. If I've already given my data to the farmers organization and it's in Kisan Diary Enterprise, then it's being shown to me like at a farmer organization meeting after the fact saying, okay, now here's how we're using your data and do you still consent or not? With the data wallet idea, which is an emerging idea and something that's not like live, right? It's something we envision, but I think what we're thinking is that if we had kind of widely available consent manager tools, and like this one we're using is built for others to also be able to kind of insert their actual, what are the benefits and what are the terms of the agreement. We're imagining that at the point that a farmer is considering sharing that data for a service, they would be able to go through an intuitive consent manager and also have clarity about how they could revoke that. And I think a data wallet structure is part of what we think is important to make that more seamless. So I don't know if that explains it, but
yeah,
right
totally.
now it's at the farm
super
organization.
Cool. I'm like, definitely want to call you and have another conversation about that.
Cool.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for that. We'll go ahead and move on to our third presentation from Marcus Schmidt from the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research. So is Marcus here? Yep, there he is.
I'm here, yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. All right, then I dive right into my presentation. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, you can probably now see my presentation, and I want to give you a very warm welcome. Maybe I can make it a bit bigger. Yes, I will give you a very warm welcome from Germany. My name is Markus Schmidt, and I work at the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research in Brandenburg, Germany. And we have a repository, the Bonneres repository. You can reach it, as you see on top, on bonneres.de. Then go to Research Data and Bonneres repository. And I am also going to put the link for you in the chat, so you can also go. Check it out if you like. Oh, that was our survey. You can also fill that in. But I'm also going to put in the link for our repository right now. I'm going to today talk about publishing sensitive agricultural data in a very practical way and examples that we encounter at our repository. And also say then some words about how to find an optimum between privacy and reusability of data. But first, what do we do at our repository? We do provide a platform for the permanent storage of quality assured research data from soil and agricultural sciences, so you can find, access, and download quality assured data. And for your data, you get a digital object identifier that you can use, for example, for your publications, and therefore people can reuse your data. And also, if you provide it, your research plots and research sites, so your geodata can also be displayed in our repository. And let me give you a short practical insight into what happens behind the scenes when you provide a data set. Ideally, it includes geodata, and you provide the data through our upload tool, and we do a basic quality check and then load it into our SQL database. You then create metadata, which we will review with you, and then it's provided in the repository. And then when a user wants to reuse the data, they can go to the repository and download it quite in a range of different formats. And they also have the metadata to be able to understand, of course, what they downloaded. So in the following minutes, I want to share some of our experiences when we deal with sensitive data and some case studies and decisions on how we are handling these situations. So about sensitive data in general, it can include personal information like names or addresses, confidential data such as financial or military information. Interestingly, and also what I find very interesting, data combinations, which where you have a certain data set, and from the data set you cannot draw any confidential information, but then you have another data set, and through linking both data sets, you're suddenly able to retrieve this confidential information. So we need to take also care about this. And sensitive data can also be biological data, for example, such as for endangered species, which when published may be counterproductive to the point of protecting these animals. And in agriculture, especially, soil quality data can be confidential because landowners may not want their competitors to know their soil quality. And in the following, I want to show typical cases that we have when we want to hide a specific spatial reference while still providing an idea where the data is from, publishing plant disease data, contact information, and data with an embargo, which is the case when people want or need to provide their data, but they don't want to give it out yet. They just want to give out the metadata, and the data will be available, let's say, in 2 years' time. But then you may wonder why even bother to publish sensitive data at all. Doesn't make sense to publish it. And from a researcher position, statistical trends and differences can often be still discovered, even without the exact place or the absolute values. And even parts of certain data sets may still be valuable, even though some information is hidden. And furthermore, for example, to understand a survey, you don't need the exact names or addresses. And for other studies, for example, to assess the state of research, even just the metadata itself can be useful. Now, going to our first example, which is spatial reference. I already mentioned that we published geodata in the Bonaerense repository, but some landowners may not agree to have the exact location published. And in this case, the concept for our developing soil profile database will be that people can choose from 3 ways to blur their data. One is to have a large raster over an area where the location of your certain point will be assigned to the raster midpoint. The second would be a circular flow. That's quite easy to understand. You just give a circle instead of a point, and so nobody can see exactly where it is. And the third is an artificial coordinate system where you give the center with x and y equals 0, then you tilt it at a random angle, and this way you still have the relationship between where your points are located, but you still don't give out the exact location of these points. And here's the example how this is going to look in our soil profile database. When people give us profiles, they can choose whether they're going to be blurred or not, and then they can choose, for example, this regional mask, which turns out to be the circular blur, and or they can, for example, give also an artificial coordinate system. So it's explained to them, and they can choose one of them. Now, the second example in our repository I want to talk about is how we handled plant disease data. So in this study, all plant pathogens were below the legal limit of the EU, but still it felt kind of awkward to give out the exact values for the exact places, and also the landowners probably would not appreciate this very much. So for publishing the data set, we did give out the exact values, but only kept a nearby city instead of the real coordinates. And another way to handle this, we did in a manuscript that I was a part of writing it. There we set standardized the data. So we changed not the location, but the data itself by centering it not around its mean value, but around 0, which is called a Z standardization. And in this case, we could still do statistics between different treatments, but we did not give out the exact values. A third example that I want to show is likely the most common. It's about contact information. And for a large European data set, the experiment owners are listed next to the site. But in some cases, though, people did not want to appear in a public data set, which is very understandable. So therefore, they all had been asked in advance whether they agree to be in the data set. And then what I found very nice is that the data set itself includes information about whether people wanted metadata on the website and agreed to it, yes or no. And if no, the contact, of course, was not to be seen in the data set. And if you want to take, for example, a look at this data set and see an example of how data is handled in our data set, and also see it on the map, you can just go to this data set on the European long-term experiments, which I just put in the chat. And the last example I already mentioned, I want to talk a bit about embargo, is not really about sensitive data, but it's that rather that people are sensitive about their data and don't want it to be out yet. They wanted to, for example, publish it first, which of course we all know you can still do after you give a DOI and you cite your own data set. But sometimes people just don't want to have the data set out before they publish it. So in this case, we give the possibility to have an embargo, and here you see that there is no download button, so people can just see the metadata of the data set, not the data itself. So in all these cases, the question is kind of how can we find an optimum between privacy and reusability of data? And I come more and more to the conclusion that a leading role in this is taken by data stewards. And the point is that an experienced data steward will be able to notice potential pitfalls with sensitive data and can then talk to the data provider to make sure it's okay to publish this data. Secondly, a data steward will also recognize data combinations which may correlate the sensitivity. And thirdly, a data steward will be able to suggest solutions, allowing to make the most out of confidentialized data without avoiding to publish them at all. And knowing that, indeed, it's important to note that, yes, sensitive data that has been confidentialized can then be shared and can be useful for further research. So with this, I motivate you to take a part in our survey that we have running about our repository and generally about data usage. It's only a few questions. You can use this QR code here, or I have already put the survey link also in the chat. And I would really appreciate if one or two of you could potentially fill in the survey. That would be very, very nice. With this, yes, I say thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed the previous two talks very much, and I'm also going to enjoy the last talk. And I hope we can also get a little bit into discussion. And I saw that there's already a hand raised, so maybe there's already a question. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention. And yes, I look forward to talk to you. Okay. Maybe then Claudia wants to ask a question.
Yeah, I do not know if I'm to ask now or afterwards, because I can see that Hannah is moving her mouth.
Yes, sorry, I was muted.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
Claudia, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Please
Thank
ask your,
you.
let's please ask the
This-
clarification question.
Thank you. This is an excellent session. I unfortunately missed the first talk, but I saw the second and this one. I have a very short question to Marcus concerning his deposit workflow, okay, data deposit workflow. And I noticed that you are using database systems. So why this choice and not the more, let us say, traditional or standard use of data management systems such as Dataverse or whatever?
So a lot of repositories give you the choice to just drop your data set in a format like an Excel file, a CSV file, and so on. And that's very quick and practical, I would say. But we are in the process of developing some tools where you are going to be able to visualize certain data and, for example, look for other databases that also contain, for example, biomass and so on. And as soon as you really want to do statistics and analysis over a larger amount of data sets, then you need some way to access all this data, not really in a file, but that's much easier into from a database. So that's why this choice was taken. And it's also a little bit easier to give, for example, related identifiers, and then connect certain data sheets with each other.
And I also have one clarification question. So your database is specifically recruiting data from just Europe, or are you thinking to go into other regions as well? And what would be the process for that?
Mm-hmm. So the database is not so much that it's regionally specific. It's more topic specific to soil and agricultural data. Mm-hmm. It started with this Bonares project, which is short for Soil as a Sustainable Resource, which is a large collaborative project with now 15 projects that are part of it, which goes over 9 years. But so it started out as providing a platform for specifically these projects, but is open to any, and we get more and more data from outside these projects, like long-term experimental data. and so on, where people see that, okay, this is really practical, because when it gets known in the community that this is specifically for soil and agricultural data, then the experience is that sometimes it's easier to go to a specific repository than to start digging for your topic in a very general, very large repository. So it's more topic specific, but it's open to everyone basically and for free.
Wonderful. So why don't we go to our fourth and final presentation, Dr. Anton Eitziger from the Alliance of Biodiversity International in Seattle in Colombia. One of the questions that I'm going to pose in our general discussion is about this idea of data stewardship and how do you identify a good data steward. So we can be thinking about that as we're listening to this final presentation. So over to you, Anton.
Yeah. So I think you can already see my shared screen, I guess. Can you confirm, please?
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah. Thank you for this opportunity today to talk a little bit about our research. My name is Anton Eitziger. I'm working at the Alliance Biodiversity International in Seattle, based here in Colombia. And within the Alliance, I'm working as a scientist for digital climate action. The Alliance is working on food system solutions at the nexus of agriculture, environment, and nutrition. And we are part of the Cgir group, and now within a recent transformation into a one Cgir, where all these centers are working on global agriculture research, coming together into one big or into bigger research initiatives. Yeah, let me just start. I'm talking about a new concept that we are working on, which is called the coffee metrics. I think compared to the other previous presentations, we are still in an earlier stage. So we are working on the concept. We have not yet developed the system, but we have started like building up collaborations and partnerships with relevant stakeholders for building up such a data sharing platform. So we are focusing our first pilot on coffee. So why coffee? Coffee is a very important crop. It's a heavily traded commodity, and most of coffee farmers globally are smallholders, and they have a very low farm income, many of them living below the poverty line. And if you look at big global research in agriculture, maybe within the CGIAR Center, there's not a lot of attention on coffee because it's not a food crop, obviously. So we have started working on coffee years ago when we realized that it's a very important crop for smallholder farmers, for farm income, and it's very heavily affected by climate change. So we have started working on quantifying impact of climate change on coffee production systems for smallholders in Latin America and Africa and Asia. So that's why we think it's a very important crop, and we as data scientists, we have been working on concepts for data sharing among research and private sector partners that are very important in the coffee sector to improve data availability. So, and also for farmers, like looking at the smallholder farmer level, coffee farming is actually a very risky business for them because they're often not able to improve their farm management. They keep very limited data records, and they cannot invest in new technologies, and they face multiple risks on their farms. Like example, risks from climate. It could be in some areas damages from frost or pest and diseases that are often related to changes in temperature. And then they're also exposed on the global market to price fluctuations because coffee is traded on global markets, and smallholder farmers are often not in a very good position when it comes to the market. And then on the other side, there's not just the farmers, also traders and other supply chain actors. They spend a lot of money to identify and reducing risks with regards to how we can get sustainability and how we can address due diligence. So in very extreme cases, I would say sometimes they literally have to send someone to the farms to validate due diligence. And this is causing a lot of high costs for the supply chain actors. So we have like this situation that on one side, farmers it's a very high risky business for farmers, but also for supply chain actors. So, but the main problem that we see that since it's not part of global research often, so this data at the one hand collected by private sector partners, but also by research, they are not connected. And so many farm cooperatives, organizations, including the public and private sector, they collect it, but they're not shared among them, which is understandable and you're like from the terms of the private sector, because data is a very, very important asset they maintain within their business. So we have started thinking about what is fundamental to achieve data sharing within the coffee sector, and we found that the most important relevant way to start it would be governance of the data sharing process, because nobody trusts, especially if you think about competitions between coffee buyers, you would not like to share your data with other competitors in the sector. So we started thinking about how we can build up trust so that all possible stakeholders having data from the coffee business, which starts from the farm level, but goes also up on the supply chain, along the supply chain, how you can facilitate this data sharing process. So we started working on a concept a few years ago, thinking about what would be a way. So I think the main important parts would be we want to improve efficiency in cost reduction for reporting and risk assessment for both traders and farmers. So we were thinking about creating a collaborative data network for coffee value chain stakeholders, which include farmers, but also roasters, coffee buyers, and could go down to consumers. All of them would be part of a trusted network for data sharing, which could be a semi-permissioned distributed network instead of a centralized network of data nodes, and would be governed collaboratively by the metrics. And data transactions would need to be protected and maybe encrypted. And the basic outcome of the metrics would be to create new insights from the combined data and create like permissioned aggregated outputs from shared data. So I will give you a very short example how this could look like in practice. So you can see here we have 4 different stakeholders in the coffee sector business. So one would be ourselves research. So we are collecting a lot of data. This could be, in this case, I'm putting the example of remote sensing. So we are using remote sensing to create AI algorithm to detect coffee lands, which is not an easy task because coffee is often cultivated as a shade tree, as a shade crop. So you use trees to create shade for coffee lands. It's not easy in remote sensing compared to other crops to make automated detection of coffee lands. There could be another actor, for example, certification body. They have a lot of farm data on certification from farmers. And then we have another partner that we, for example, working on making an AI algorithm for yield estimation. It's called Croppy. So this is an NGO. And then finally, we have also on the local level, coffee cooperatives and farmers that may have data about pests and diseases, for example. In this case, I'm putting here coffee white steam borer, a very common pest in Uganda, for example, that is presenting a high risk for farmers producing coffee. So if you can combine these different data sets from different stakeholders, we could create a yield forecast for certified organic coffee, and we would aggregate this data on a spatial grid and present this data, and all the different stakeholders being part of the network could have access to this new created indicator. So what have we done in the past? So we have started, as I said before, a few years ago with developing a technical concept. This was funded by CTA, and we worked together with European University, the University of Salzburg. We worked, us, ourselves, the Alliance Biodiversity and CIAT. We worked with a startup in Uganda providing farm data management for coffee cooperatives. And we did this within the big data platform for agriculture within the Cgir. So we worked on a technical concept that would be one way. Obviously, there are many ways creating such a network. Using, in this case, we used the approach of building up it as a blockchain system. We use the Hyperledger blockchain, having the advantage that it's open source. So you can install it on your own server. You don't need to use cryptocurrency, and you have kind of a governed system because you need compared to a public blockchain, you have a private semi-structured blockchain. So you have to make the validations with authorized stakeholders. So we build it up so creating the risk metrics, or calculating the risk indicators within chain code scripts, and we present the outputs on a spatial tiling system that we aggregate data on different levels of occurrence. So you can look at the data at a country level, but you can then, if enough data is available, zoom down to a regional level or even village level to see aggregated data on a map about specific indicators. We are now starting we are working now on a new partnership with different stakeholders to find a first case of making a real pilot, like developing a short technical system that we can run the data and calculate indicators. We have several options. One option would be Uganda, but we're also discussing about Vietnam. So, and on our current partners that we are discussing with, so it's nothing set in stone yet, but we are working on a partnership between several organizations, institutions, private sector, universities that have been worked in Uganda with coffee. And so there's like this common basic interest of how we can set up a system for data sharing in the coffee sector. One aspect that would be very important, I think, is also the governance of this matrix system. We were discussing among partners, so this should be something that is accepted by all of them. So this could be something like the Cgir or maybe FAO or others that are working in the global agriculture sector, but not necessarily being a private sector company that would then maybe develop it in a different direction. I think I will stop here and thank you a lot for your attention. And yeah, any questions? Thank you.
Wonderful, Anton. I have a quick clarification question. So this is a prototype, and kind of in keeping with our focus on data governance and data ownership, who would you foresee to be the kind of owner or steward of this kind of a linked database?
Yeah, it's, as I said at the end, we have discussed this within a work group that we organized within the Strike 2 event in Amsterdam at the end of last year. And the basic agreement among all these different actors that are in this coffee supply chain, they say it's very difficult if it's a private sector steward. So it would be better if there's some of this or a bigger institution that is working in global agriculture. So I mentioned two of them before. The Cgir could be one, or it could be also FAO, being the governor of like creating this net, or maintaining the network, because basically if you really use a blockchain network, then it would be distributed. So you don't need a centralized data owner of the system.
Right. That's wonderful. Okay, so we have 20 minutes. We've just had four very, very great and interesting and very diverse presentations that together have come around the idea of producing open access or public good approaches to agricultural sustainability. So digital tools that seek to empower farmers, facilitate the sharing of information for the benefit of those farmers' livelihoods, those farmers' sustainability, but also towards our broader kind of collective objective of making agriculture more sustainable. That seems to be a theme that's come across the four proposals. We have several kind of discussion questions that we could bring forward. One that I'd like to bring forward and maybe hear from each of the panelists in turn really is around this idea of stewardship. So if we're looking at the idea of farmers having control of their own data and being able to choose to share into a data wallet or a Farmstack or a repository such as Mark has presented, or into even a blockchain network such as Anton is, what is the process by which such a steward is selected? So who governs the steward? And that's something that we're really struggling, this idea of, what is public interest when, the government may or may not represent a particular farmer's perception of public interest. And so I'm curious, maybe if we could just have a quick go around and each panelist speak for just a minute on what is your vision for, if in a given project it's identified that a data steward is needed to protect the public interest, what would be the process by which that steward itself is governed? So kind of a meta. Maybe we'll just go in the same order, Sarah Louise, then Alicia, then Marcus, then Anton.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. I don't know that I have a comprehensive answer to that, Hannah. But
You will
thank
at
you
the
for
end of your
question.
PhD.
Yeah, I know. I am curious about the many words that are used to describe these roles and responsibilities within the apps. And so what I've seen thus far in terms of data stewards has less to do with data sovereignty and data justice than it has to do with like quality assurance and like just the procedural steps of managing the database. And so, yeah, we don't have a data steward assigned in our group. And in what I've seen elsewhere, sometimes that role has less to do with the data justice principles and just like, where is the data stored? So those procedural and instrumental aspects. And please do correct me, other panelists, if I'm misunderstanding the way that that role is usually enacted. But with like the Bona Res, Marcus, with yours, I see the data steward in my understanding as that step of the quality assurance and like the first point of contact if you want to know if you can access the data. But in terms of a broader philosophy of data governance, I guess I see that as needing to be linked to those bottom two aspects of data justice. So having to do with structure and like systemic goals for the sustainable agricultural transitions and for data justice principles. So I guess what that means for me in practice is that I'd like to see the role of a data steward or some other name for that person to be in direct contact with the users of the app. And so for us at LightFarm, I think that the data steward would need to be directly informed by and responsible or accountable to the users and their shifting and diverse priorities on their own data rights. And so we're seeing some farmers want, under no circumstances, the data should never be sold to anyone ever. And other farmers see the data as a valuable asset and want to have the ability to share that data. So that's one of the tensions that I would see the data steward or data governance lead, or in one of the other panels this week in IGAD, they were talking about the popularity of chief data officers as another level of like the CEO, COO coming up in organizations. And so I think that person would need to reconcile, be accountable to the users, and also have space for users to make their own decisions and navigate that. So I want X and not Y, and that might be different than a different user. Not a very clear answer. We can unpack it some more, but I'll stop myself there before I ramble any further and pass it off.
Great, Alicia.
Yeah, so I'll try to I think break down two concepts, the way that we're using steward and how we're thinking about it, and then maybe a more general steward idea. So within the Farmstack protocol, basically we started this work in Ethiopia, and we're working with the Ministry of Agriculture and the Agricultural Transformation Agency. So that's an entity that is still public sector, but is kind of it's a partner entity, right? And we actually are setting up steward roles for both. So that's kind of interesting, right? You can have essentially overlapping stewarding roles. And I think it's not that you want to have lots and lots and lots of stewards, but it's understandable that you could have a national steward, and you might also have a steward for like Anton was talking about the Cgir or FAO. I can completely envision a FAO or a Cgir being a steward a different set of ecosystem players. It's not geographically bound, but there's like a data exchange ecosystem that could be envisioned that benefits that set of stakeholders. So I think the first thing is to say that I should also clarify, I'm not a technologist, but my understanding of other protocols is that it's common to have multiple sort of stewards within different data protocols. And so within ours, we're tending to look for, we started with public sector entities that have a desire to see data exchange for the benefit of efficiency in that ecosystem and sustainability, trying to improve services, and are frustrated that they're not seeing that exchange happen. Also entities that have data that they want to share. So we started in Ethiopia because it served some of their advisory system interests, but now it's kind of part of the broader ag ecosystem architecture that they're thinking about. We just signed an MOU in Kenya with the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization for a similar reason. They have a large public data set that they want to share with certain data usage policies attached. And they also want to see others sharing data with them and with each other to sort of improve services and sustainability. So I think public sector entities are where we're starting from. But we've had recently, people asking us, would you consider, could you envision a consortia playing a stewardship role? And I think we're open to kind of thinking about the different instances that make sense. We haven't, we're playing a steward role where Farmstack's being used, but hasn't yet been kind of homed with a new steward. There's some places where that's happening. And I guess, so my answer is, I think part of the solution is you have multiple stewards. So if a steward is actually behaving badly, at least in this approach we're thinking of, you could switch to a different steward's ecosystem as a user. That's one thing. A separate kind of answer is, I think in terms of data stewardship more generally, yeah, we're really excited about the idea of farmers organizations being able to play kind of a stewardship role for farmers longer term, and that's certainly happening. Many organizations already do this, but I think, how do we think about what it looks like to support farm organization digital capacity and the sort of the particular role, like you were talking, Sarah, about data officers. Same thing in a farmers organization. Many farmers organizations have already started hiring people who are essentially doing data entry or in other ways kind of helping to solve this problem. How do we formalize and support that role and how they interface with members? So that's sort of stewardship with a little s, but just wanted to kind of call that out, that I think this community governance approach is something we're interested in and thinking about the role that farmer groups play there. So pause.
Right, that's super helpful. Marcus.
Yeah, so from my perspective, because we are a repository for scientific data, is that a data steward for this scientific data is probably best to be a scientist, because you can put yourself in the perspective of a data provider, which I had been before that, and you can put yourself in the perspective of a data reuser if you have ever done a meta-analysis or something like this. So that's very important, and it in my position, for example, it really helps me to have these experiences. And the constant question that I ask myself when I get a data set: can a reuser, by the information they give and by how they describe the data, can they really reuse it? Is that data of a quality that is really useful to somebody else? Because that's ultimately what a repository is for. And of the importance of data stewardship in general, I want to say one more point, that 5 years ago, when I was still mainly a researcher, I was in a position that I loved repositories where you could just drop your data in 10 minutes. And I was like, why should I spend so much time describing my data? And that was really frustrating me. And now that I'm on the side of a data steward, I'm really a fan of curating the data and providing and getting data that is really useful. Because sometimes, I've seen examples where people get a DOI for data that's just called test. And, that's, in the end, that's just trashing the data ecosystem. But whenever, you want to get quality assured data, you want to get good data from users, but I cannot stress enough to always put yourself constantly in the position of the user, of the data provider. Give a good service to them, And when you do that and you make it easy for them to give you the data and to describe the data well, then this is really, you're going to be successful ultimately. Have a good connection to them, because that really helps. So it's So putting yourself in the position of the user and reuser for me is a key point of a data steward.
And really grounding in those relationships. I mean, I think this, as we turn to Anton, one of the things that I'm struck with is we often build these relationships on the ground, specific farmers organization, a specific research group, specific set of users for specific purpose. We work a lot with farmers groups who are looking to document participatory organic certification data. And so finding a digital tool to facilitate that process. Once you start scaling up to, global data sets, national data sets that are then used for kind of policy making. So, as we turn to Anton, in the CG system, what do you see as the role? If you were to look at the CG as a data steward, what is the purpose of that? So how would the CG sort of curate and promote the use of such kind of more global data sets to affect policy?
Yeah, that's really, as the last one, I try to not repeat what we already discussed. Yeah. So I will bring in two new aspects. So one for me is power, and the other one is pressure. So I would say it's very important. So we as a CGIAR center, for us, it's very important to support farmers and to help them. So I like the idea of having farmers having more control about the data and deciding. So what Alicia talked about the Farmstack. So it's really a good way of, we have to look into the future into this, so how we can balance the power of data. So currently it's obviously the one who is collecting the data has the power. And this is often in the sector, in the example I brought of coffee, it's often the coffee buyers themselves, because there's no data, so they are forced to collect data. And it's us as research, so from universities to everyone is collecting data, and I think the farmers are the last one that are collecting data. Sometimes they do, but so in the future it would be very good to see that farmers are having control over their own data. And then I would say the second aspect that I'm bringing in is we are thinking also how we can reduce the pressure for the stewards, because what we did in the past, often we tried to make data sharing platforms, and it ended up always in just piling all data together, and then it's very difficult to maintain a system of tons of data. So you need to maintain it, get updates. So it's not easy to have a centralized global data base. So that's why we started, when we started brainstorming about the metrics, how can we make it more distributed, reducing the pressure of the steward, because he is just responsible to guarantee that there are the right permissions and nobody can access the data from another one. So I think in the new era that we are going now with having distributed system, we are getting there in different ways. So we should not think about having a new big data center where we pile all this data together. We should think about having what Alicia also talked about, very good protocols that are open source, that can link together, so we can combine this protocol processes, and having a network of collaborators that say, okay, we are willing to share our data under very clear defined rules. And so we can all of us contributing our data into this partnership, we get access to new insights, but we don't necessarily need to send our data there. So that's for me the point where I don't know technically, I can talk, I'm not a developer, so I can talk easily about that. But I think we are getting to the point where we can develop systems. We don't necessarily need to send the data. So having just the metadata, we just know who has what data. Just then, when it's really relevant to calculate a new indicator, we then access them, but we're not collecting them like in the storage just in case. So these are the two things that I wanted to bring in: power of data and reducing the pressure on the steward.
Wonderful. So I'd love to open it up to the audience, and also I think for the panelists themselves, if you have questions that you'd like to ask of each other or additional comments. We have just 5 minutes left, so there's time for for remarks from the audience or additional thoughts that have arisen for the panelists? I have lots more questions, but I'll just do that pause, waiting for somebody else to ask a question. Okay, so I will ask one more, and kind of it's coming back to this idea of sensitive data. And let's take endangered species as an example. So there's, if you link data sets, for example, we have the iNaturalist or Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and you start to link that with farmer management data from some of these tools and services that we've been talking about. And then it's quite easy for a researcher or say a government verification officer, it's now becoming technically much easier to police land use. And this has positive implications for improving land use management and verification where there's kind of bad behavior happening on the ground, but it also is something that is frightening to some farmers who maybe are doing the best that they can and aren't really interested in receiving an environmental fine. And I just was thinking about how as environmental research is increasingly able to access this data, what are the ethical implications of that for farmers on the ground? And are there implications for farmers losing their land when it's becoming identified that it's a location for endangered species, or is it an opportunity conversely for payments for ecosystem services to facilitate better management practices? And so you can see the directionality can go in many ways from this increased ability to access very different kinds of data from very different sources and then start to put them together. What are the ethics and responsibilities in that, kind of from the perspective of governments or farmer service organizations or data science tool providers like any of us? So I guess I would just put, maybe that can be our final go around in terms of the ethical implications of data sharing and data stewardship, and how, what is the one kind of idea or learning that you'd like to put on the table for people to think about as they go forward with these kinds of projects? What would be a caution or a suggestion on how to facilitate best practices in environmental management and agricultural management without becoming a policing mechanism?
Why don't we go in reverse this time?
That means I start, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I can maybe just talk in this case from our own experience or from the experience of research. I think it is very common among universities, but also now within the last few years, it also became a very present topic inside research, global research, to comply with ethical policies in research. So to avoid that any harm of risk for research participants could happen. So we have set up a few years ago an institutional review board where we look at every research activity so that we make sure that no human or animal research participant could be harmed through the research. So this is a very important step that I would say from our side. So we try to be very rigorous on that. But I'm not sure if obviously this is different when it goes to private sector, maybe, or yeah. So I think I stop here because we have very few time.
Marcus.
Yeah, that's a tough one, I guess. My take, or my small take on this would be to, as a data steward, to constantly be aware and to have awareness when guiding the publication of data. Don't fall into the trap of just going through your mechanisms and just publish things, but always keep an open mind and think about, is there any even though the person might just willingly give you the data, but should you take some precautions before you should be maybe some kind of filter before letting it all out. And if in doubt, you should probably confidentialize the data. So yeah, that would be my idea on that.
Totally. Alicia.
Yeah, I guess it's a great question and one that I haven't thought a lot about. But the thing that comes to mind is just the importance of, in this kind of environment that we imagine emerging, where hopefully it's more decentralized, where there is more agency being exercised by individuals, thinking about the fact that aggregation is still going to happen to make that data useful. And so coming back to this idea that representative community groups, farmers organizations become increasingly important areas to focus kind of capacity strengthening on behalf of those members. So I'm thinking about, not only do farmers organizations become, entry points where service providers come to the farmers and say, I think I have a product or a tool you want, and maybe they become the trusted guide to help their members decide whether or not to use it. But also in the instance that you're explaining, I'm thinking that they maybe also become the advocate for the farmers to be at the table as that conversation about trade-offs is happening. So I think not only thinking about the technical capacity strengthening, but like actually thinking about how we invest in the strengthening of these existing collective networks to become advocates using that data in those conversations. I guess that's the idea I would leave us with.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really key. Like, I think a lot of times in these, user policies or consent forms, we're always thinking about the individual, but you're right. I think a lot of that, if we're wanting to use kind of these data analyses for policy advocacy, really we need to be thinking about, at the community level or group level. And so some kinds of community consent might be interesting to think about as well. Okay, so we're just at time, so I'll leave Sarah Louise with the final word and to thank our panelists. And I want to thank Sarah Louise for pulling together this excellent panel, and also thank Emma and the IGAD group for convening us as well. It's been a lot of really useful and interesting conversations, and I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, I don't have much to add on that point other than I was thinking similarly to Alicia in the need to integrate deliberative inclusion in the process of making those decisions. And so I think it's important to ask them and critically hold the space, but I see my role in this conversation mostly in terms of outlining the risks and benefits of the different pathways of what it could mean for farmers, and then listening to them on what it should look like, because some indeed are interested in having payments for ecosystem services, and others that avenue of sharing that kind of information on endangered species is absolutely unacceptable. So looking forward to having more of those messy conversations and bringing them to the forefront in our work. But thank you all so much for attending. It was great to see how many people joined and stayed for most of our time here, and it is recorded. So when the link comes out, feel free to share with your networks if you think there was something valuable that you'd like folks to hear. But just a great thank you to our panelists. I learned so much from you all, and I can't wait to keep in touch and learn more about your work today. So thank you. And hopefully you've enjoyed some of the other sessions on the annual meeting over the past couple of weeks. And I believe there's one more tomorrow that I'm looking forward to attend on a similar topic. So thank you again, and feel free to get in touch. I'll put my email in the chat to talk about any of these things. So thank you, folks, and hope